Hello, I am Jameson Gilmore, and this is the Racism, Policing, and the Prison Industrial Complex from San Francisco to Palestine. Systems of policing, incarceration, and surveillance often determine which communities experience safety and freedom. In San Francisco, marginalized residents, including Black and Latino women and formerly incarcerated individuals, often experience unequal treatment and discrimination within the criminal justice system. These experiences demonstrate how the prison industrial complex shapes everyday life within the fault line of San Francisco. The ACLU of Northern California, as the primary stakeholder, advocates for policies that protect civil rights and reduce racial disparities in policing and incarceration. At the same time, other stakeholders such as the San Francisco Police Department, community organizations like the Young Women's Freedom Center, and reentry programs such as the Five Key Schools and Programs all influence how justice and safety are defined within San Francisco. In Palestinian Prisoners, Smuggling Freedom, Writing from Captivity, Basil Farage explains how writing allows incarcerated individuals to resist systems that silence their identities, which reflects the concerns of the ACLU of Northern California about how incarceration within the prison industrial complex can suppress marginalized voices in the fault line of San Francisco. Basil Farage explains that Palestinian prisoners use writing to resist the isolation and dehumanization effects of incarceration. Through letters, poetry, and personal reflections, prisoners document their experiences and maintain a sense of identity while living under confinement. This demonstrates how incarceration systems attempt to silence marginalized voices while individuals search for ways to reclaim agency and visibility. Similar concerns appear in other resources used in this project. Mark Griffiths and Gemina Repo show how surveillance and restricted mobility limit daily life and autonomy, while Christian Turney demonstrates that formerly incarcerated individuals face discrimination and psychological distress after release. Ida Wilson further reveals that Black and Latino women in the San Francisco Bay Area experience racial profiling and unequal treatment from police. From the perspective of the ACLU of Northern California, these examples illustrate how systems of policing, surveillance, and incarceration can reinforce inequality within the prison industrial complex in the fault line of San Francisco, which is why the organization or advocates for reforms that protect civil rights and address racial disparities. In Women's Lives Beyond the Checkpoint in Palestine, Mark Griffiths and Gemina Repo explain how surveillance and restricted mobility shape daily life and reinforce inequality, which reflects the concerns of the ACLU of Northern California about how policing and monitoring practices within the prison industrial complex can disproportionately impact marginalized communities within the fault line of San Francisco. The perspective of the ACLU of Northern California connects to key ideas from each of the project's research sources. Mark Griffiths and Gemina Repo demonstrate that surveillance systems restrict mobility and shape daily life, showing how monitoring practices can reinforce inequality. Basil Farage explains that incarcerated individuals use writing and storytelling to maintain identity and resist systems that attempt to silence them, highlighting the importance of protecting the voices and rights of incarcerated people. Kristen Turney shows that formerly incarcerated individuals face discrimination in housing and employment after release, which extends the effects of incarceration beyond prison walls. Finally, Ida Wilson shows that Black and Latino women in the Bay Area often experience distrust and unequal treatment during police encounters. Within the fault line of San Francisco, the ACLU argues that these patterns demonstrate why reforms must prioritize civil rights and reduce excessive surveillance and policing, and create fair opportunities for individuals affected by the prison industrial complex. In Discrimination and Psychological Distress Among Recently Released Male Prisoners, Kristen Turney argues that incarceration produces long-term psychological and economic harm even after release, which relates to the concerns of the ACLU of Northern California about how the prison industrial complex creates ongoing barriers for formerly incarcerated individuals in the fault line of San Francisco. Turney's research shows that formerly incarcerated individuals face long-term barriers to housing, employment, and social stability, highlighting how punishment continues after release. The ACL of Northern California emphasizes that these barriers perpetuate inequality in San Francisco and advocates for fair opportunities for those re entering society. Farage shows that writing allows prisoners to resist control and maintain identity, aligning with the ACLU's focus on amplifying voices of marginalized communities. Griffiths and Repo illustrate how surveillance and restricted mobility, like checkpoints in Palestine, limit access to resources similar to over policing in San Francisco neighborhoods. Wilson highlights that Black and Latino women experience profiling and unequal treatment, showing how policing reinforces bias and distrust. Together, these findings connect to the ACLU's advocacy for civil rights and community support. Addressing incarceration's psychological and economic harms, limits on mobility, silenced voices, and unequal policing experience, reform must consider both structural and human impacts to reduce long term inequality. In Some Are Good, Some Are Bad, perceptions of the police from Black and Latino women living in the San Francisco Bay Area, Ida Wilson examines how policing practices shape the experience of Black and Latino women in public spaces and affect their sense of safety, which relates to the perspective of the ACLU of Northern California, which advocates for equitable policing and protection of civil rights for marginalized communities in San Francisco. Wilson's research shows that Black and Latino women experience racial profiling, unequal treatment, and reduced feelings of safety due to policing practices. The ACLU of Northern California emphasizes police accountability and reforms in San Francisco to address these inequalities. Similarly, Farage demonstrates how incarcerated individuals use writing to maintain identity and resist systems of control. The ACLU sees these narratives as essential for understanding the human impact of incarceration in shaping policies that protect dignity and civil rights. Griffiths and Repo show how surveillance and restricted mobility create daily uncertainty and reinforce inequality in Palestine, a perspective the ACLU applies locally by critiquing over-policing in marginalized communities. Turney's research highlights the discrimination formerly incarcerated individuals face in housing and employment, extending systemic disadvantage. Together, these studies illustrate how the ACLU's mission to promote fair treatment across policing, incarceration, and surveillance aligns with the experiences documented in all four resources, reinforcing the need for meaningful criminal justice reform in San Francisco. The ACLU of Northern California argues that racial profiling, over-policing, and mass incarceration create systemic inequality in the criminal justice system in San Francisco. As a civil liberties organization, the ACLU advocates for policies that protect constitutional rights and address systemic racism within the criminal justice system. The organization often raises concerns about racial profiling, surveillance practices, and incarceration policies that disproportionately affect marginalized communities. Through legal advocacy, police research, and public education, the ACLU works to promote reforms that increase accountability in policing and reduce discrimination. These efforts aim to create a justice system that treats communities in San Francisco more fairly. The San Francisco Police Department argues that policing strategies and surveillance technologies are necessary to maintain public safety in San Francisco. The San Francisco Police Department views policing strategies such as patrol presence and surveillance technologies as important tools for preventing crime and protecting residents. Law enforcement officials often argue that these measures help maintain order and improve safety in communities across the city. However, organizations such as the ACLU of Northern California and advocacy groups like the Young Women's Freedom Center argues that these strategies can contribute to racial disparities and increased surveillance in marginalized neighborhoods. This disagreement highlights how different stakeholders interpret safety and justice in San Francisco. Community organizations such as the Young Women's Freedom Center and the Five Key Schools and Programs advocate for rehabilitation and reentry programs that reduce the harms of incarceration in San Francisco. The Young Women's Freedom Center focuses on supporting women and girls who have been affected by incarceration, trafficking, or systemic inequality. Through mentorship, leadership training, and advocacy programs, the organization helps individuals rebuild their lives and gain access to opportunities that were previously limited. Similarly, Five Key Schools and Programs provides education and job training for incarcerated and formerly incarcerated individuals in San Francisco. These organizations work alongside advocates such as the ACLU of Northern California to promote alternatives to incarceration that prioritize rehabilitation rather than punishment. The ACLU of Northern California and local advocacy organizations such as the Young Women's Freedom Center and Five Keys Schools and Programs argue that policy reforms addressing racial disparities in policing, incarceration, and reentry support are essential to reduce systemic inequality and ensure equitable access to safety, employment, housing, and community resources for marginalized populations in San Francisco. Marginalized communities often experience the most direct effects of policing and incarceration policies. Black and Latino women report experiences of surveillance, profiling, and distrust toward law enforcement, while formerly incarcerated individuals struggle with barriers to employment and housing. Organizations such as the Young Women's Freedom Center, Five Keys Schools and Programs, and the ACLU of Northern California work to address these challenges through advocacy, education, and community support programs. Their work highlights how the prison industrial complex affects entire communities within San Francisco. In conclusion, systems of policing, incarceration, and surveillance often reinforce racial inequality rather than create equal justice. Research from Basil Farage, Griffiths and Repo, Christian Turney, and Ida Wilson demonstrates how systems of surveillance, incarceration, and policing often produce long-term inequality for marginalized communities. These patterns appear both in global contexts such as Palestine and local fault lines such as San Francisco. Stakeholders including the ACLU of Northern California, the San Francisco Police Department, the Young Women's Freedom Center, Five Keys Schools and Programs, and affected residents all shape the ongoing debate about criminal justice reform. Addressing these issues requires policies that prioritize civil rights, community support, and equitable opportunities for those most affected by the prison industrial complex. Thank you for listening. Attached below is my works cited and my hyperlinks to my digital media.